right. Hello, everybody. As you saw last month, we had David online here talking about the neuroexperiential model. We did an overview, and we talked about the fact that we're going to have a series of videos, and this will be the next in the series. And we thought it would be good to talk about framing in Brainspotting and how to look through the neuroexperiential lens and in framing. And so without further ado, I'm going to invite David to come on and give us another lesson on framing and the neuroexperiential model.
Well, it'll be other than a lesson, it'll be sort of a dialogue, although I'll probably be talking mostly in the dialogue.
Okay.
So, the neuroexperiential model, I have been working on for many years without even knowing it. In fact, it started even before the discovery of Brainspotting with the ice skater. It's really been sort of an evolution for me as far as how I see the therapeutic process, both from what I've been taught, what I've studied, and what I've experienced, and most of all, what my clients have told me and taught me over the decades. But so when the idea of the neuroexperiential model came to me, it wasn't like, well, this is something new. It's really, this is a way of understanding and explaining, all the different concepts, but particularly to take it away from the traditional top-down way of looking at things, the traditional Western way of looking at things, the traditional way of psychotherapy as being a model of diagnosis, of history taking diagnosis and treatment, which is a kind of a frame, but it's really a very unwieldy and a very unattuned frame from my point of view. So just to sort of reiterate, the neuroexperiential model gives brain-spotting therapists a way to think about things and concepts and terms and language to describe things that is consonant with what we experience, what we do, as opposed to using diagnostic language that ends in disorder, which goes against the developmental model, goes against the model of trauma, dissociation, attachment as being areas that get disrupted, and that end up giving what look like and what we call symptoms, but they're really just reaction patterns or organic manifestations to experience, to developmental experience. So it's really been a reconceptualization, and we don't use the term. I mean, anybody in the brain spotting world can use any term they want, okay? Because it's an open model, and it's an expansive model. It's a permeable model. So what I'm saying is, I'm giving out the ideas for everybody to hear and process and do with whatever they do. And the only thing I recommend is that you be in process with it. You have your own evolution with it, and that you receive it however you receive it, and then you work with it. And you'll hear me and now others talking about this more and more, other trainers and leaders. But it's really, I guess, the neuroexperiential model is an expansive model. It's an expansion. It's an expansion away from the Western. It's an expansion away from the diagnostic model and the treatment model, and it's an expansion into uncertainty. It's an expansion in terms of how we sit with uncertainty and how we experience it and what happens in the context of uncertainty. So with that, I want to go to one of the key cornerstones of the neuroexperiential model, which is the frame. Now, if you were to ask me exactly what the frame is, I couldn't really answer it. That's the first definition of the frame, that it's undefinable, and then we go from there. And it's undefinable because the word and the concept is literal. Frame. like picture frame, like the frames on the pictures behind you, or your, your license or diploma. But it's in that the literal sense is the frame is what encompasses and as such defines that which is within the frame. Okay. But because the brain is quantum, because the brain is holographic, there's no literal linear frame in and of itself. So I'm going to give my explanation of what the frame is almost by how it works, and in that context, try to link it into what I've said thus far. And anytime there's anything you want to jump in with to comment or question, please do so.
Sure.
One of the main conceptualizations about the frame, and I'm going to step back from this. To this point, I have pretty much developed the lexicon of brain spotting, from inside window, outside window, gaze spotting, Z-axis I didn't invent, but I mean, that comes from mathematics. But the frame, I mean, this frame is just a word from common usage, but as what it means in brain spotting, I've sort of chosen that. And the term setup has in many ways taken over from the term frame, or maybe it just means something different. I chose setup to go away from the concept of protocols, or the procedures of protocols. Part of the definition of protocol is that you have to follow it. You have to comply to the protocol, which is good for research, but it's not good for attuned therapeutic relationship work. So instead of calling it the steps of the protocol, it's really just the setup process, to use organic, natural, real words to describe what we're doing. We're setting up the frame. Although I sort of countermand that by saying we don't really set up the frame, we receive the frame from the client, and I'll expand on that. But when people say, what's the setup for? When they talk about a setup, the setup only exists to serve the frame. And I know I'm not going to be able to change this vocabulary, because it's there are reasons why it has sprung up and why it's used all over the world. I don't know what it's translated to into Japanese and Romanian and so on. But the term, the more accurately, from a brain spotting point of view, the term should be, what's the frame for? And then it follows from there, well, how do we set up this frame? Okay. But anyhow, I just wanted to say that because I'm using my language, but everybody's going to use their own language. By the way, Shri, just on my thing about setups and frame and the language, do you have any comments on that?
I have lots of thoughts, which I can comment on here. So we often, when we're teaching, we talk about it being guidelines. And it just reminds me, as human beings, how much we want something to hang our hat on. We want, do this when this happens, which takes us, out of uncertainty and into certainty. We want the safe path, but when I'm hearing you talk about the frame, what I am thinking of is that and when you talk about the service of that, the setup helps us get access to the beginning of the frame, just the very beginning, because once we get to that beginning, like where it goes and what shape it takes and how it morphs and so forth, like we're just there holding the space and witnessing. So those are my thoughts that are coming up as you're talking.
Okay. And because I've reconceptualized the frame to not be something that we set up, but that forms inside the client long before they get to us.
Yes.
And that we receive it when they bring it in and hold it with them. And in essence, what I called, the setup is really helping to form the frame that we are holding with the client.
Mhm.
so that it is attuned and consistent with whatever it is that they're bringing to us. And it can be anything, but it's neuroexperiential, it's developmental, it's expansive. Um, but the purpose of the frame that we receive and hold is to create a space inside of it. And that's a very literal way of putting it, but it's really not that way at
Mhm.
all, you know.
Mhm.
Uh, and it becomes really hard to kind of describe what it is, but it's sort of it's how the client shows up, why they show up, how we receive them, how and what happens in that process, what we do mindfully in relation to what the client shows up with in the beginning and every session and throughout every session. But then it's that which happens that wouldn't happen in the same way if they didn't show up with us and we didn't show up with them
Mhm.
and be together in this way. And we call it, focused mindfulness, which is another way of describing processing. I think it's a more accurate description of the processing in Brainspotting. Um, so in that way, to look at it from backwards, the frame is that which promotes, and optimizes the focused mindfulness processing. But I'm going to take it back to earlier than that. We don't set up the frame with the client because the client comes in with their frame. Well, how is it that they come in with their frame? What does that mean? Well, everybody lives their life. We all have our own generational history. We have the history of our creation and of our intrauterine development and of our birth and of how we are come out into this cold, crazy, chaotic world. And then what our early days, weeks, and months are like, and early years. Um, um, so a frame can really be anything. If someone is musically talented and they become a musician, that's a frame. That's their musical creative frame that they carry into this world, and they develop and however they develop it, and it's developed inside of them, it's developed with others, so on. And then how they develop as a musician, whether it's playing an instrument, singing, or composing music, happens inside of that particular frame. So this can apply to everything. So the frame that a client brings is one out of countless frames that they have. But it is a frame that has formed in relation to that which created a sense of discomfort in them in terms of how they feel, in terms of what they think, in terms of how they interact with others, and in terms of how they're able to behave or perform, act. And any or all of that, which is becomes uncomfortable, becomes painful, becomes confusing, becomes blocked, or feels like it's blocked, or becomes problematic, forms that which ultimately leads the client to come to us, and that which ultimately they bring to us. So really, the frame is formed, is generational, it exists before we come into existence,
Mhm.
But that's our generational frame. And then it's our the frame of conception and the intrauterine experience. That is the frame. And then the birth experience coming out of that is the frame. And then just early life and how our early attachment issues go, and all the other neuroexperiential aspects of where we come from and how we develop. But most people don't come for therapy in this world. Now, that's not to say that most people couldn't benefit by therapy, especially a process like Brainspotting, but most people don't come for therapy. So when we determine, well, who is it that comes for therapy and how and why is it that they come? They're really a select few. I like to say that there are barriers. The first barrier is being able to even think, well, I need help with this. The quintessence of that is I can't work it out on my own. I've tried to work it out on my own, and what I haven't gotten enough, or I haven't been able to work it out on my own at all, which ultimately leads to seeking out somebody to help oneself. Most people who recognize that they can't work it out on their own still don't go for help. Okay, it's just mathematics. And then when you finally decide, I can't work it out on my own, and I need help with it. This is the coalescing of the frame. The beginning coalescing of the frame that the client brings to us. But then they have to go through a process of, of deciding to seek out the help. And that's where a high percentage of people fall off, because it's really hard. It's a hard thing to do. And then to go out there and to find the therapist and what modality and all these things, it's a miracle people ever get to us at all. And it's why by the time the person walks in for the first session, it is so overdetermined. It's so compelling that they come and how they come and the frame that they bring, that the dynamic process has already been going on for a long time by the time they walk into our office. And it's really important for all therapists to know this. This is not just a brain spotting issue. This is for all therapists, but particularly for us, because we work in a very mindful, strategic sort of way. And then they have to, as we know, you can finally find a therapist, and whether you go through some kind of referral network or through somebody that you know, or just randomly, there's a good chance you're going to walk into the office of someone who may not be the right person for you, or may not have the right modality. But somehow, when a person walks into our offices, they have gone through so much in order to get there. They have overcome so many obstacles to get there. Okay. And it's because of that original essential thing of, I can't work this out on my own. And it is painful, and it is inhibiting, and it's crippling, and whatever that is, and even if the person never told us what it is, we know that's what they're walking in with. And whatever they tell us, whatever constitutes history, is just going to be a small fraction of what they're coming in with. Okay. You take a history, how much of generational trauma is going to come out if you take a history in the first session, the first few sessions, like most therapists do, or again, prenatal or postnatal, or attachment issues. So that's where, however we take history, we should be mindful that it's not just neocortical information. A lot of it is subcortical. A lot of it is experiential, and that the information that we have about the client that we call history will be coming out throughout the entire process. And the most salient history that we get, using that term, I'll just call it information, comes out during the processing. And it's more, however the process goes, than the specific, tangible information that comes out of it. So in the neuroexperiential model, it is recognized that the person has overcome tremendous obstacles to get to us, and that they are so driven, and they're so motivated, even if the client doesn't seem motivated. They are, just by showing up. They have to be. But that which brings them to us is their frame. And we could say frames, because there's so much that goes into it. One frame contains infinite frames. How's that for another conceptualization, Sheree?
Yeah. Good luck trying to figure this out, everyone.
Well, the fact is, you can't.
Right.
Because it's in the context of 1 to 4 quadrillion synaptic connections, and us being carbon beings that go back to the Big Bang, and but the idea that we should know, we have to know, we can know, and that from there we determine what to do, is the neuroexperiential model says that's impossible.
Mhm.
It's one of the essential elements of the neuroexperiential model. Okay, so knowing from a frame point of view that what brings them there is that which is the frame and that which is inside of it, that which is inherent to it, means that we receive when they call us for the first time, or email us or text us, whatever it is, that's where we begin to receive it. And when they show up in our offices right away, okay, and no matter what your opening question is, if it's, what brings you here, okay. I once had a supervisor say, don't say, how can I help you? Okay. And she said, well, if they knew what help they needed, they wouldn't have to come to us. Now, I'm just dropping that one because it's part of my own history of what I heard. So I like avoid that one. But
Mhm.
if I'm going to say something, what brings you here? But whatever it is, everybody, we know what works for us.
Mhm.
By the way, one of the things about Brainspotting is we don't tell you what to do. We give you information, we give you an experience that then has to make sense to you. And then you incorporate it into who you are and how you do things, not just as a therapist, but as a human. So for that first moment they walk in, we're receiving that frame. And, we see them in the waiting room. They're sitting there with that frame. It's conceptual. It's not like they have a hula hoop around them. I thought you might smile on that one, Sheree. People can't see, but
I'm just trying to take it all in, David.
okay. But they walk in. It's right there.
Yeah.
And if we are mindfully attuned, if we are present, if we are philosophically present to this experience, which is our experience as well as theirs. As soon as, the relationship starts, it's a shared experience, which is the frame itself. That's, the relational frame we talk about. So they bring in the frame. We don't set up the frame. They bring in the frame and we receive the frame and we attempt to begin to hold it with them right from the beginning. And it's really important for us to be mindfully aware of this because it gives us a frame or a framework, a context by which to show up with the client. And most of us have never been taught these kind of ideas, as far, and we kind of figured it out, and we know how to, how we do it and how to be successful with it. But the more clarity we have on all these things, the more present and attuned we can be, and the more the process can be simplified as opposed to complicated. Thoughts, questions, Sheree?
Yeah, a couple of things as you were talking. I just want to emphasize the presence piece because, I know as soon as I make contact with that client, whether it is on the phone or whether they're walking into my office, the presence piece really makes a difference because that's when you're going to get a lot of rich information that you might not get when you sit down and do an intake. So I'm very aware of that. The other piece is that I want to share. I remember doing an intensive with you years ago in Ecuador. And I remember 6 months before I even came to the intensive, I was processing and was aware that my brain was working on the issue that I was going to bring. And so it's, how I'm conceptualizing it in my head. When I sat down with you, I kind of see it like a picture, like a bunch of picture frames going really quickly. That one moment in time and holding the frame in that way was like and I know you have a saying about this, but it was like a footprint in the water. You have some kind of saying about, or the river, the river. So I can't remember your saying.
Well, you can only step in the same river. You can't step in the same river twice.
Yes, thank you. That's what's coming to my.
That's not mine. That's an old Buddhist saying. But anyway,
okay. But that's what's coming to my mind, is that you can do months of work prior to even getting into that appointment. And then when you're in there, you're taking that frame in that moment of time and those guidelines and all of that, and you're having that bottom up neuroexperiential experience. And somehow it's reorganizing for that client. So I could go on and on, but that's what's coming up for me.
Well, and what you're saying, and this is very important, is that processing happens inside the client's frame before they even get to us.
Right.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
It's not efficient enough processing to get resolution, but processing goes on all the time, and before people get to us, they're processing. During the session, it's a focus processing, and then they're processing as they leave, and they're processing until they come back for the next session.
Mm-hmm.
And that processing conceptually is happening inside of that evolving process frame. Call it a process frame because the frame processes, the frame moves, grows, evolves, not along with that which processes inside of the frame or as a result of the frame.
Mm-hmm.
Now, here's another part of the neuroexperiential model, which makes use of basic concepts of trauma and dissociation. We know that the nervous system is wired for regulation, for equilibrium, for stability. And that's physiological as well as neuroexperiential. So it's like, unless you have some inner ear issue or some other issue, if you start going too far to this side, you lose your balance and you straighten up. No one ever taught us to do that.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And learning how to make use of that ability is what happens when a baby takes its first steps. It's being able to balance, because otherwise they lose their balance, they fall. But all of our systems are wired to regulate and re-regulate and co-regulate and come back towards regulation. And the frame that clients come in with is a frame where they are not able to go from dysregulation sufficiently towards regulation. Okay, neuroexperientially, neurobiologically. Why is that? Well, and this is theory. The theory is that, and there's some theories that say it's trauma that causes dissociation, or dissociation results from trauma. Some actually say trauma results from dissociation. That's more the structural dissociation model. So there's a lot of different models out there. But the simplified version that I'm putting out is that traumatic experiences, and it can be generational, it can be pre-birth, but traumatic experiences create the dissociative. They cause the dissociative survival instinctual network to come online to try to do its own form of self-protection and regulation. But if it's too much of it, too early, too extreme, and so on, it sets up, we call them dissociative barriers or dissociative capsules. In terms of what actually the neurobiology of that is, it's not that, but it's like our best way of understanding it. It's so complex that we don't really even know what it is. But I believe that dissociation is a survival reflex that the brain knows how to do in utero. That's my theory. So, so the idea is that a network of dissociative barriers forms in response to traumatic experiences, and I'm using that very openly. And as such, it provides the survival, protection, and structure, and so on, that the young individual and their system needs. But as development goes on, it doesn't, as more adaptive, more highly developed survival mechanisms and adaptations come on, this dissociative network doesn't just go away. and that whatever it is and wherever it is and however it is, it still remains mostly in the same way. And that creates the blocks, that creates that which impedes the system from going from dysregulation to regulation. Okay, so that's my simplified theoretical way of looking at it. It comes from everything I've learned and everything I've been taught and everything that I've experienced in the work. So the idea is that the frame that they bring in, that they need us to receive and hold with them and help shape with them. And you don't just shape it, set it up, and boom, it's there. It's constantly being shaped, as we go. It's dynamic. Creates the experience by which the system can begin to somehow find these dissociative barriers, networks, and begin to provide healing in those contexts. Okay. For me, it's based on the fact of the system recognizing that what happened a long time ago is not happening now, and that the survival mechanism for then doesn't have to happen now, because the circumstances are different, the system has evolved, and the present is relatively safe, assuming that it is. If it's not, then that's another clinical kind of issue. So that the frame provides that what we call the focused mindfulness processing is literally the neuroexperiential process of the brain, because of this dual attunement frame, starting to figure out how to find these dissociative barriers, not how to just break them down, but how to sort of be present with them, so that those networks can begin to have a different experience. It's almost like a prosthetic, barrier that allows the system to begin to feel some sense of change, possibility, not safety, because that doesn't really exist, but another way of doing things. That's a very neocortical way of describing it, but it has nothing to do with the neocortex. And what happens is, when we sit with the client, and it's based on the relationship, it's based on the body awareness, it's based on the eye positions, whatever they are, and it can be one or it could be many in a very complex pattern, is the process, the focused mindfulness processing is the system in a change in the state of coming out of dysregulation, moving towards regulation. Now, if it's a simple trauma, which we know doesn't exist because life isn't simple, then the system may find its own adaptation, its own regulation, re-regulation in a few sessions. Client's very lucky if it happens. We're lucky if that happens. But this process, usually because we're dealing with developmental issues, we're dealing with complex trauma, it may be very or severely complex, trauma, is that the system is in this process, of finding its way. And most of it, whatever the client says to us, is just, an acorn on the Pacific. We think that the information we get, that really tells us a lot. Well, it tells us something, but it doesn't tell us that much. Most of the processing happens, and it's deeply subcortical and somatic, or energetic, or spiritual, or however you want to say it. But in the concept of the frame, the client brings the frame to us. We hold it with them in the manifold ways that we hold it with them. And then the processing happens inside of us. But when they leave the session, they take a different frame with them than they came in with. And then they are processing inside of this different frame. And our resonance is on that frame because it's relational. So it's different than the frame they had before they ever saw us. And when they come back for the next session, they're coming back with a different frame than they left the last session with. This is a very different way of looking at psychotherapy, because very little attention is given to what happens in between sessions. All the attention is given on what happens in the sessions, but most of the change happens in between sessions. You know, you've heard me say that, and you've been teaching this for a long time. So the frame is constantly evolving. Okay, and it is our theory that as this happens, okay, that the neuroexperiential systems are coming out of this the dissociative networks that have resulted in the dysregulation and are gradually finding their way towards regulation. But the brain is so complex that we don't even know how that happens. The only way we know it happens is by we take a SUDS and it tends to go down, and then the client gives us their feedback, and they come back and they said, well, I felt differently, or I was able to do this, or, you know, but for the most part, we don't really know what that is. And that makes the frame very important because it's something that it's not really tangible, but it's something that we can hold on to. We can have some sense of what it is, especially as we're evolving our definition of the frame in the face of complete uncertainty, complete mystery. Questions or anything you want to jump in with?
I'm just trying to wrap my mind around this last piece. What was coming up for me was that as we hold the frame for the client, as we receive it, I should say, that I was just seeing a bunch of frames like with inside the client, and the client witnessing their own frames as we're witnessing the client's frame. That's what my brain was doing there. And I find it very interesting what you said about you know, generational and in utero experience. I mean, we do know that from the research that we've been able to do that babies' systems are impacted by the stress of the mother, and that does influence the environment, you know, in the room. And then my brain even went even further than that, in that, okay, I mean, there's lots of stuff out there about your mother was inside your grandmother while you were inside your mother. And so then I started going to epigenetics. So my brain is kind of really going quantum right now.
Oh yeah, and that's very holographic, you know.
Yeah.
The main concept of the holographic is that each part contains the whole. That's kind of what I was hearing as you were talking. Now, by the way, every psychotherapy is frame-based. It's just they're not defined that way. Talk therapy is frame-based. The problem with talk therapy is there isn't enough space for processing. Brainspotting is not the only processing therapy. There's a lot of processing therapies, and many people who are going to watch this have been trained in other processing therapies. What a processing therapy means that you set the stage for something, which we call a frame, and then you see what happens instead of trying to interactively make it happen. Whether it's with, you know, talk therapy, insight-oriented therapy, more cognitive-based therapy, you know, that you create that the more space you create, the more processing that happens. Okay, and you could say so the body-based therapies are frame-based therapies. We can go through each one, but the thing is, it is my belief that the more mindful we are about what is and what isn't, experientially, existentially, this is the core of the neuroexperiential model. The more mindful we are about the frame as we're talking about it right now, and as everybody is listening to it and thinking about how you use it with your own clients, the more mindful we are about it, the more effective and attuned we are in how we hold it, and most importantly, how we observe what happens inside of it. This whole thing of wait, you know, why am I talking, or the idea of waiting for the clients. When you really get this concept about the frame, you know, that it's the client's frame and we're holding it with them, and then stuff happens because we're holding it with them, you have to wait. You know, it's like, how else is you hold the frame with them, and then you see what happens. If you hold the frame with them and then you try to do something, it can't possibly help the process. Yes, if a client needs more support or guidance, or if they get destabilized, and that's where we, make the frame smaller, at least temporarily. But when we do that, when it's more contained, we're still trying to keep out of the way. We're just holding the space with them, holding the frame with them, in a more contained, supportive way. But still, the only thing you can do with the process that happens from this frame is to follow it. There's nothing else you can do. Once you really get that, and this is when we talk about the frame, the dually held frame creates the focus mindfulness processing, which is neuroexperiential. And the person experiences internally, we observe it, we sit with them, and then they tell us whatever they tell us. But it's like a rocket ship taking off.
Well, you're talking about consciousness, you're talking about presence, and sometimes we're not there. Some of the old therapies are more about what we do instead of how we are with the client.
Well, that's sort of like being in the train station, trying to figure out about your journey when the train left 3 hours ago. And then you wonder why you're not getting anywhere. It's because you didn't get on the train, and you didn't let the train take you wherever it takes you. To try to do something from a neuroexperiential point of view is an impossibility. We're facing a system that is unknowable. So what do you do in the face of a system that's unknowable? You just sit with it and you observe, totally without any preconception. And then you see what happens. We call that, trying to get into the tail of the comet. But from a scientific and a mathematical point of view, to do anything else is to be, trying to do the impossible, or trying to know the impossible. What are you thinking now?
Well, there was a thought there at the end. Yeah, it left. I'll have to.
Okay.
Yeah, it left me. I can't remember what it was. It went so quickly through.
Yeah, well, that was very neuroexperiential.
Yeah.
And the idea of like, well, how much therapy does a person need? How much brain spotting? And when is it done? And so on. That belies the fact that life is life. And life has its beginning, and it has its process, and it has its end. And the person comes to us, and we're going to step into their lives. They're going to step into our lives too, for that hour or whatever it is, for a week. And it's really whatever the client chooses. Some clients leave what we call prematurely, meaning we know that they could get more if they continue to come. And some clients keep on coming even when we don't know why they keep on coming, because we don't see what they're getting out of it. Well, it's not premature for the first client, and it's not too long for the other client. It's a matter of their existential choice for what they want in their lives. That comes from the shared space and the shared time, the shared frame with us. When someone says in the beginning, how long is this going to take? As I say, what you put in is what you get out. And if a person, using the train metaphor, if a person gets on a train, people are watching this around the world. So, but let's say in New York, if they get off in Philadelphia, well, then they traveled from New York to Philadelphia. If they stay on and the train goes out to Pittsburgh, goes to Pittsburgh. If they get off in Pittsburgh, well, that's what they get, And who's to say what's right for a person? A person can only have a sense of it for themselves. And who's to say, well, this is the right thing or the wrong thing? You can only leave that up to that infinite system that has its own sense of knowing that is in the other person. Yeah, this is another frame conceptualization. Everything really is a frame, of sorts. The entire therapy is a frame, from when they come in through all the sessions and when they leave, that's a frame. So we're holding that frame with the client also. And when we teach a training, we teach the brain spotting from a frame-based point of view. Those 3 days, each person comes in and they have their own frame of what they're there for, and then it becomes part of that, unified frame that we hold together and go through that process, learning, growing, evolving, bouncing off each other. And after 3 days, people leave and they take that. They're taking a different frame with them than they came in with, And for phase 2 and my trainings and the other specialty training, it's all other versions of the same thing. It's all experiential.
So I would say to everyone out there listening that we tried to talk tonight about something that is unknowable in the best words possible, that we could, and know that the frames are infinite within the sessions, within inside the client, within inside of us, and we're bringing those together and holding space in a focused mindfulness way, because that's what we're able to do. Would that be a decent summary of?
It's more than decent.
Okay.
But the thing is, how do you work when you recognize that you don't know anything? The answer is when you recognize that you don't know anything, then you can begin. That's your starting point.
Yeah, sitting in humbleness and in respect and reverence, for the client, and feeling honored and that it's a gift that we're able to do this. I mean, those are some of the words that I would use.
Right. And the last thing that I want to say on this is that it's not only dual attunement frame, it's dual processing. Okay. It's not just the client who's processing, we're processing too. And our processing, we come in with our own frame as human beings, as therapist human beings. And then, this is part of limbic countertransference, or all forms of our response to the client's experience. Their processing effectuates our processing. And our processing that affects their processing. So there's really a dual processing that goes on. It is our role to be mindfully aware of the client's processing. And that's the way that we focus our processing. But of course, limbic countertransference causes us to drift or lose focus. And when that happens, our processing is then veering away from being mindfully present and attuned with their processing. But we could postulate that the client is affecting us as much as we're affecting them. The only difference is that it is overtly about the client's needs. And the only need that we have is, this is our profession, this is how we earn our living, and this is what we choose to do with our time and our lives, which is significant. Okay. But everything is complex, everything is multi-layered, everything is dynamic in this. And most of it, to know that it is, but to know that you can't know what it is really a state of wisdom, and it's a state of grace. That's what the neuroexperiential model is about. And that's what the frame and the context of the neuroexperiential model is about.
I think that's an excellent way to finish our talk tonight, David. So I just want to thank you for sharing and coming and explaining these different pieces.
Well, I want to thank you for holding this frame with me during our discussion, because this discussion and everything I had to say was in the context of a particular frame. So we just shared it and experienced it and observed it together.
All right. It's wonderful spending time with you. Thank you.
Same here.